There are a lot of really unpopular opinions about fantasy fiction. Today, we're going to tackle some of the most unpopular opinions and say, hey, do people have a point? Are these valid? Or are they just a bunch of kooks? They might be your opinions. I don't know. Let's find out.
Hi there, welcome to Fantasy for the Ages, show where father and son sit down and talk about fantasy. I'm the son of that equation, Zach.
And I'm the father, Jim. We talk about fantasy. That was weird. You
I
just
don't know,
mixing it up
I
here.
just had like a little bit of a significant beat in there that just kind of like felt like it needed to get serious for a moment. I don't know.
Okay. Well, my son, it is good to be with you here today as we get to record, talk about opinions. You know, we're booktubers. There's a lot of opinions in this space.
Yeah,
That's what makes the world go round. We all have opinions. Your opinion and my opinion do not always line up.
no,
This
they
is
do
true.
not.
There are some really strong opinions out there these days, though, about the state of fantasy fiction, where it's at now. And so, what we're going to do in this episode, I've got 13 different opinions I found out there. These are not my opinions, though. In some cases, I might agree with them. But mostly, these are really rabid, strong opinions people have about fantasy that we'll just take a moment to chew on.
So when you
Is there a
say
point?
an unpopular opinion, what you're really saying is it's potentially controversial, but the person who holds it is holding really strongly to it. It's not like it's only two people in the world have this opinion. It's that unpopular.
No, these are all things that many people would agree with, but I'd say the majority don't.
Okay.
Okay? But those who hold to it feel pretty strongly about these things. And it's like, okay, should we just dismiss their thoughts because they're just wrong?
I
Or
don't
is
know.
there something to it? And that's what we'll chew on a little bit here. And if you enjoy this conversation, don't forget to give us a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so yet. And thank you to our Patreon supporters for your faithful support month after month, helping us keep this content out. All right, no particular order to these 13. Let's just dive into them. Here's the first one. I was thinking of you as I put this one because, you know, you've been known to enjoy the occasional romance fantasy, or more
Oh yeah,
commonly now known as
romantasy.
romantasy. The opinion that's out there is that romantasy is watering down the richness of fantasy fiction in order to just churn out books that are giving primarily young women what they want: quantity over quality.
To
What do
that,
you
I
think?
will say that you are incorrect.
Not just me,
But
not just me. This is opinion that's
no,
out
the opinion is incorrect, not you. The
there. Okay.
opinion is incorrect, but in a particular way, because you're not incorrect to say that plenty of romantasy is watered down trash. You're not wrong to say that. However, you are wrong to say that it is changing the face of fantasy, that it is making it so that we're watering down good stuff. I'm like, no, we've always had watered down trash within our fantasy. We are getting more of it that has a romantic vibe, that is written geared towards women. These are things we are getting more of, but we're not changing the quality of fantasy writing. It's just as prevalent that we have good fantasy and boring fantasy that's not very good. I've read plenty of stuff from the 70s and 80s that I didn't think was very good.
Yeah. Well, that's just because your tastes are different. But, you know, John A. Douglas, author, booktuber, made a big splash with a statement last week that, I think it was last week, it might have been the week before, that, yeah, there's a problem with booksellers now and what's out there, because I think he was in a Target, and he took a picture of the fantasy section, and all it was covered by was Sarah J. Maas and Iron Gold. No, that's not the right word. Iron Flame. Is that it?
Iron Flame would be book 2 of the Fourth Wing stuff, yeah.
Yeah, the Fourth Wing stuff. That author, I forget her name at the moment.
Rebecca Yarros.
Okay. Just plastered all over. Books like that and other hard-hitting, grittier fantasy books that, in John's opinion, a reader like him would be interested in, you couldn't even find. It was just all of this romantasy stuff. And it's like, this is a problem.
I don't think it's that big of a problem per se, especially going to Target, because I remember the day when I went to Target and went, none of this looks interesting, but I think I've seen some of these on my mom's shelf because it's always catered to that kind of genre
Oh.
book. It's just now we're getting fantasy in there as well. So we're still getting the romance, we're still getting some of these mystery thriller things. So maybe it's not your kind of book, but I think the spaces you're looking in didn't have your kind of book before either.
The positive to romantasy, I think, is that yes, it may be bringing a bunch of new young female readers, but they may then gravitate to trying other kinds of fantasy too once they found, hey, there is something for me in this fantasy genre.
There's something to be said about the quote unquote watered down romantasy being a gateway into bigger epic fantasy.
I can't speak to a lot of romantasy because you know I avoid it, but you have read some of it. I mean, does it smack of being a little weak in world building, formulaic in the
Sometimes.
style?
Sometimes absolutely. Sometimes absolutely not. It really does depend on the book.
Okay.
And as I've dabbled more into romantasy, I have actually come across sometimes here and there other books that I really loved that I wish had a little bit more, that I wish it developed their relationships a little bit better and weren't so scared to actually show a relationship between characters.
Okay, here's the second unpopular opinion. The fantasy genre lacks innovation. It's simply recharging the same old tropes again and again and again. Thought?
Again, I personally have to disagree, except for the concept of, yeah, there's nothing new under the sun. Everything is constantly reinventing stuff in the same, like the same things over and over, maybe different ways. Fantasy I enjoy partially because it does give a much different context to potentially real issues. But we haven't stalled out. We are still trying to invent new ways of tackling fantastical things, in my opinion.
Yeah, having been a fantasy reader my whole life, I've seen a lot of innovation. And I think yes, we can use tropes, but we can use them in new ways. We can do new things with them. I continue to find fresh things in fantasy fiction. So I would definitely think this is not an opinion that has a lot of weight to it.
I mean, trying to compare the Conan the Barbarian books to the Greenbone saga and say, yeah, it's just recycling the same stuff. It's like, no, it's you didn't read either of those things.
All right, here's my third one. I'm interested in your thought on this. Classic fantasy, such
Yeah.
as Tolkien, no longer relevant in our modern age because it's literally out of touch and it's not worth reading anymore.
Having just done a reread of The Lord of the Rings, it's not out of touch. There is something to be said that not every piece of classic fantasy is going to connect in the same way, but certain pieces are going to have staying power, and things that are said about the human condition through fantasy aren't lacking. It's still there. And I'll even go the step further. Some books take on new meanings throughout time. As long as they stick around enough to continue having readers, problems that exist in our world now maybe didn't exist then. And so take the idea of AI as we keep going. This is an idea that is new to us here and explored differently through sci-fi and things, but was explored previously. And the idea of what it does it mean to be human has been talked about for a long time and in a lot of things. So I don't think they're lacking in relevance or getting out of touch. They're just following a similar cycle of media throughout time that a lot of things fall away and you only get some core staples that stick around.
Some people these days, look at the classic fantasy and they get irritated. They're like, well, where are women in this? It's like they're not even relevant. There's no LGBT representation. Like that part of society didn't even exist. And therefore, they're like, no, there's no point in reading trash like this anymore because it denied the world of its time. I'm like, no, there's great themes and stories still in here. Just because it didn't see the world the way you want to see the world now, it was partly a product of its time, but that doesn't make it completely irrelevant and trash.
And to be fair, I'm not going to come to bat for every piece of quote unquote classic fantasy. Some of it I think is trash. That doesn't necessarily have to do always with how it depicts the
There
world.
you go with your Donaldson again.
It also doesn't say that classic fantasy is without faults. if you're missing things that you do love seeing in a modern context, those things might be missing, and those might be flaws that you don't care for in the book. It doesn't mean it's not worth reading, potentially.
Okay. Next opinion. World building is overrated. Some readers claim authors spend too much time on elaborate world building at the expense of character development or plot momentum. They argue that endless invented languages, maps, lore, it slows the story down and serves more of a self-indulgence than actually bringing value to a narrative. Authors that are targeted with this are Sanderson, Stephen Erickson, and even J.R.R. Tolkien.
The counter opinion to this is that world building, especially in depth, isn't just a skill, it's an art form. Not everyone's great at it, and not everyone's going to land it every time. It can get bogged down and boring, especially when you're trying to do something on such a big, epic scale.
Oh, look at the trees. Let's talk about the trees.
So if you don't like that, maybe that kind of epic fantasy just isn't your cup of tea. Doesn't mean fantasy's not yours, but the bigger, full-on create your own world, get into that epic tome fantasy might not be for you, because sometimes they're really, really good and they are able to do that whilst still showing all these other things and do a show not tell system. And sometimes they do get bogged down in the exposition a little bit.
Yeah, for me, great world building advances the narrative and informs the motivations of characters. It's an integral part of the story. Do some authors go a little overboard because they really dig building the worlds? Yeah, probably. But it's got to be really bad for it to interfere with my enjoyment of this experience in this fantasy world.
My bigger problem with big in-depth world building actually comes into play a little bit more in like an indie or self-published author scene, because it's a big pitfall trap for new authors. People who are so excited to explore their new world, but haven't quite not nailed down how they want to write yet necessarily. And so they get bogged down in their machinations of the world and forget to continue moving forward the story.
Yeah, there are things about the world you've created that your readers don't need to know yet. You can circle back around to it. And sometimes that events that will happen and character motivations that will exist because of the world they're in that you just don't have to explain yet. Leave a little mystery. You'll be able to fill in those gaps later. Yeah, so I think you have a point.
And it even is fair to say that this one is something that is reader specific. Some people just really don't like doing that. Their brain doesn't love like exploring and creating a whole other world, and they have a problem connecting to the story. So at the end of the day, even when it's done well, it might not work for you.
Okay, my fifth one for us here. Again, these are unpopular opinions. I'm not saying this is my opinion.
Sure, you're not.
Tolkien is overpraised. So some will consider that rather spicy. There are readers who believe J.R.R. Tolkien's influence has actually stunted the fantasy genre because it, for so long, locked it into a medieval, European-inspired setting with elves, dwarves, orc tropes, and an archaic writing style that newer authors are still writing under the shadow of, rather than being able to fully innovate. What do you think?
I think this is an opinion that only gets to really be had because we are here where we are, because we're so much later past this. It's wrong.
It's so wrong.
But the nuance of what is actually, like, the words themselves aren't necessarily wrong. What people are actually meaning by it is. I don't think Tolkien necessarily is... I don't think it's wrong to say he's overpraised. I think some people do put Tolkien on this pedestal. So it's not wrong to say that he's overpraised. There's too much hype around Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings. I also don't think it's true that we're so stunted and stuck in those tropes and those fantasy things, but also people enjoy them. That's why we're still stuck in them, not because Tolkien wrote them.
See, it's not that Tolkien is overpraised. I think we do need to acknowledge the debt we owe Tolkien. His success in creating something that there was nothing like before established the niche in which fantasy was able to grow, develop, and thrive. Have a lot of people, then authors, followed in his footsteps? Yes, because it worked and they liked it and they enjoyed it and they wanted to be like Tolkien. But we're seeing a lot of diversity now, and diversity in the fantasy genre that couldn't have ever come to be if we didn't have Tolkien's solid performance and profitability to follow and to give us a little protection, a little shielding, a little grace.
I think Tolkien in the fantasy genre should be viewed in the same way that figures like Einstein and Newton are viewed by physicists. They should be revered for their time and for what they've given us. And to some extent, what they've done still stands the test today. However, where we have gone since then far surpasses some of the things that they talked about, and sometimes they were even wrong about some things. But we must acknowledge they are the giants that we are standing upon the shoulders of.
There you go. All right. I think we've covered that. Let's do number 6. Grimdark fantasy is edgy for the sake of being edgy.
Some of it is.
The popularity of Grimdark, Song of Ice and Fire, First Law, has led some to argue that it's become just as formulaic as the high fantasy that it originally was rebelling against. They say many authors mistake nihilism, sexual violence, or cruelty for mature fantasy.
Grimdark should not be put on a pedestal. It should not be viewed as a break from the norm that is refreshing for all these reasons and things. No, it's a certain subgenre style. And if this is your singular and only favorite form of fantasy and you think all fantasy should be this, I'm concerned about you as a human. I think you probably need therapy.
Perhaps.
But good Grimdark isn't just that. It isn't just an author sitting in their little edgelord palace and having little torture fantasies. That's not what good Grimdark is. It's not just that.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, some Grimdark is that, and if it is a genre that you enjoy, you do kind of have to wade through finding what's the good Grimdark, what's the Grimdark that maybe could be good, but also has you concerned about what the author might do in their free time.
Yeah, I think there is definitely a point to authors who just lean into the Grimdark trope to be edgy, to try to get followers who like Grimdark, but they're not really doing it all for the best of value. But I've found some great self-published Grimdark authors that it's just brilliant. So
this is an opinion that I think has some definite merit to it, but there's a little more nuance than that.
Agreed. Number 7. I think you might like this one. Magic systems are becoming too scientific. There's backlash against rigid, rule-based, hard magic systems, like we refer to Brandon Sanderson's approach all the time. Critics feel that this reduces the wonder and mystery of magic and makes it feel like a video game mechanic or a science project.
Validity? This one is a matter of preference, in my opinion.
Okay.
My personal preference, I love getting to explore a magic system. And I love being able to look at some of the nuances and the intricacies and how does this work. And I think it's almost sometimes a little bit lazy when you leave it too open, because it's left in the world of, well, I need a Deus Ex here, Magica. So magic.
Deus Ex Magica. Yes.
And that's not to say that every time a softer magic is that. Sometimes soft magic is beautiful. Sometimes hard magic isn't done very well. But I don't think it's a disservice to the genre to have harder magic systems.
Yeah, if you want to explore more about magic systems, go check out our playlist on rating magic systems. We looked at a whole bunch of different fantasy series and the kind of magic they hit and how soft versus how hard it is. There's a lot of variety out there. And I think you're right, Zach. I think it comes down to preference. Some will love the hard magic, and others, that just makes them gag. Just give me the soft stuff and give me a great story.
I'm just glad we can sit with enough perspective to say we don't feel like we have to come real hard on one side or the other on this one.
Right. All right. Number 8, standalone fantasy is better than any series out there. This opinion honestly bucks the norm. Some fantasy fans argue the epic series is what it's all about, but others are like, no, that stuff starts to become bloated. It loses steam. Like one of our favorite series, The Wheel of Time, has that argument against it. It was too long. It got bloated. It lost steam. Standalone novels They tend to be tighter, more focused storytelling because they got this one book and that's all they got to get it done. They don't have to commit to spread stuff out over 10 books and 5 prequels and blah, blah, blah. They're just going to give you one hot, tight, awesome fantasy tale. That's the unpopular opinion. The standalones are better than all the series. What do you think?
I'm not necessarily going to disagree that standalones can have a tighter, more finished singular plot. They lose out on some opportunity for depth and development. And the biggest place I think I see this is that standalones have less opportunity for character development. You get characters as they are usually, and then they go through circumstances. You don't often get to have as big of an arc with a character in a standalone as you do in something else. I think there's an argument to be made for multiple people about what is your preferred length of fantasy. Do you like standalones? Do you like trilogies? Are you a 5-book preference person, or do you love the 8 and above books? Do you love those really long series? And each reader's going to have their own sweet spot. It's hard committing to a really, really big one. So it's okay if you prefer standalones or trilogies or 5 books.
Mm-hmm.
But if you also really prefer those really long series, that's okay too. I don't think any one is better than another as a format. Whatever works for you, there's going to be some books in that format that are fantastic. There also are going to be some that are garbage.
I have found very few standalone fantasy novels that just sing for me. I lean more into trilogies and series that can develop things a lot further. But, I think of a book like Tagana by Guy Gavriel Kay. It's probably the best standalone fantasy novel I've read. And it's awesome. So if you can pull it off, yeah, that's great. But man, I would struggle saying these are better than series in general.
Can you really call that a standalone?
Oh, yes. Tagana? Yes. What would you connect it with?
Is it not technically connected in with the world of Fionavar?
No, not at all.
I do not know this book well enough, apparently. I haven't read it.
Yeah, you need to read it.
I certainly thought it was still connected with the world.
No, totally different. Or I'm completely wrong, but I'm pretty sure it's totally different.
I'm probably
I have read it, so. Here's an opinion I found out there, and I'm like, oh, really? Fantasy has a diversity problem, even now. So, despite progress, this is where critics will say the genre still centers too much on Western, white, cis perspectives too often. They critique the lack of non-European inspired worlds, or how diverse characters are often tokenized or just sidekicks rather than leading major roles.
I don't know that I fully disagree with this opinion, simply in that it has for a long time. Clearly, that's not an argument that this has been something that diversity has been lacking for a long time. That also, however, is kind of just true across publishing to a certain extent, especially as a reader in America. A lot of what I have access to, or did have access to, was what was being published. And that was what was controlling the game. Things have changed. Things have gotten better to where I don't think that there's necessarily a lack of stories that do highlight or have people of color representation in main character roles, Eastern themes, all of that. I love the progress that I've seen. The part of this opinion that I do still agree with is that there is a tendency in a lot of more like Western white focused narratives to tokenize characters.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are certain tropes that are founded in relatively racist notions that could be used to go away.
I can't argue with the initial premise that a lot of original fantasy, more classic fantasy, definitely had the Western European, white male-centric perspective. That's where fantasy got its start. That's what sold. Things have become more diverse over time. I think we've perhaps swung too far in order. We've got people who just have a passion now to balance the scales, so much so that the scales are balanced the wrong direction now. Like they're the other direction. I get this from knowing people who are out there trying to publish things that are a little more traditional and no one will touch them. If you don't have all these other things that they're looking for, publishers won't even read your books now. They have no interest. So those sorts of things can only get self-published these days. Can't we ever find balance? We have to swing one way, now we swing completely the other. It's a messed up thing.
And from a reader perspective, I don't think we're necessarily in that it's swung over thing, but from an author and trying to get published perspective, I don't know that you're necessarily wrong. I think if you look at it from a reader's perspective of what is there out there to be read, because there's this backlog of so much that was Western focused, because that is the norm. When you look at what all is there to read, it maybe feels a little balanced. But I could see absolutely the point you're saying, that trying to publish something that feels older in style, that feels more Western inspired, can be harder. Absolutely.
And there's a huge audience still wanting that content. But now to find it, they got to go read the old stuff. They can't find new content of that style anymore because the publishers aren't putting it out.
I don't necessarily want to be full black and white, because they are still putting some out. It's just harder. I think you have to have something that stands out better.
Or you're a very established author already.
That too.
All right. Number 10. There's too much focus on tropes and subverting them. So older fantasy leaned heavily into tropes. I mean, it invented tropes.
Mm-hmm.
Some argue modern fantasy is obsessed with subverting them to the point of exhaustion now. Readers sometimes feel like stories are more concerned about being clever with the use of tropes than just telling a good narrative, a good story. Thoughts?
I think I get more satisfied when reading a book when I turn my brain off of that part and only turn it back on after I've finished reading the book, and then analyze it and go, okay, what all were the tropes and what were the things? And yeah, I see it when I read, but there is a tendency sometimes to try and subvert it too much, and sometimes stories do suffer. I think that's valid.
Okay.
That being said, things that are just heavily tropey often also suffer from poor writing.
Yeah, what we need more than anything else is a good story. That's what I always say. I'm here for the story. I don't care what tropes you use. If the story captures me, takes me away, gets me engaged, and, we're talking about a good story, that means you've also created good characters that I give a whit about.
Using or subverting a trope is not usually going to deter me from a book one way or another, because you can't really go one way or another or put two words on a page without using or subverting a trope.
Okay. Number 11. There was a time when there was no such thing as young adult fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
The unpopular opinion is that now YA fantasy has saturated the market. Some adult readers complain the market is so flooded with YA that's formulaic, featuring similar protagonists, the rebellious teen girl, the love triangle, the chosen one, and with less challenging themes because it's written for a younger audience, that it makes it harder now to find more mature or experimental works. Thoughts?
The average reading level in the United States is 3rd grade.
That's so sad.
That is my thoughts. If you want this to change, if you want to have a higher level of reading content throughout more of it, help improve the educational system. Because people are going to publish and write what sells. And what's going to sell is what appeals to more people. So if more people are reading at a lower level, more is going to get sold at a lower level, and you're going to feel like this market is getting oversaturated.
So you're saying your response to this is that people are stupid.
I mean, in a very, very general way. Not to say that if you enjoy that level of fantasy, I do often enjoy a YA novel. But if your gripe is that all that's being written, all that's being put out there, all that's being pushed is this lower, less intellectual, less adult content, it's because it's being written to where people are generally tending to read.
YA is very prevalent because it does sell. Yeah. I have found some YA fantasy that I did enjoy.
There's a lot of fantastic YA out there.
But it's no Steven Erikson Malazan content, that's for sure.
But there's a lot of people who couldn't get through the first book of Malazan and think it's too highbrow.
Yeah. They don't want to work that hard.
And
They're
there's
lost.
nothing wrong with that.
Well, maybe.
I don't think so. But these are our opinions.
Our opinions. All right, number 12. This one could be hot for you, Zach. Dragons are boring now. Some readers think dragons, which were once the awe-inspiring fantasy icon, are overused or reduced to cliche. They become so normalized that they no longer carry any mystery or menace. They're just another trope. Yep, use the dragon to check off the list. What do
I
you think?
love when you get a good dragon replacement. I love chasm fiends in the Stormlight Archive as being kind of this big, unsurmountable monster kind of creature like a dragon without having dragons. Not that the Cosmere doesn't have dragons, but I also am just always going to love a dragon. I don't need the big monster or the big something to be a dragon. I love new versions. I'm never going to get tired of a dragon. That's just me.
I think there remains a place that the dragon used to fill of the unovercomable entity. You know, that the protagonists may not be the baddest, biggest, best entity on the planet. That there are things you cannot overcome and you just have to deal with. And you have to find a way to work around or escape or just die from. You know, and that's what dragons always used to be.
And, well, you say that's what dragons always used to be. Pern's pretty old in terms of what we're seeing in writing, and
Those
dragons are
aren't real
definitely not that in
dragons.
Pern.
Those aren't real dragons. That's different.
It's the dragon riders of Pern. You gotta count them as dragons. They
I'm
don't fit
thinking
the
more
trope of
Dragonlance,
dragon.
man.
They don't fit-
Dragonlance. Those
there's a
were
difference-
real dragons. You couldn't do you got eaten.
There is a difference between the trope of a dragon and dragons just as a creature. And the trope of the dragon is that big bad, and that is the thing that you really can replace with other non-dragon-like things. But you don't need to. It can still be a dragon. I think the biggest problem with this thought process and thinking that dragons have lost their edge is when you compare dragons, the creature, being used in other ways to that big menacing dragon. It's like those are being used as different literary devices now.
Okay.
You don't always need a dragon in a story to be that big scary dragon.
All right. Final unpopular opinion. Fantasy doesn't need a map. There's a camp that believes fantasy books don't need to be including maps, that maps actually make the world smaller and overly literal. These people prefer settings to unfold in the reader's imagination and just let it go wherever it goes for you. Don't get bogged down. It's like a map becomes like a hard magic system and you're tied into rigidity. No, fantasy doesn't need a map. What do you think?
I think epic fantasy that is truly making its own world and things, needs a map. If only because some readers have a hard time picturing things in their head, period.
They want to picture, they want to make connections.
And or have a hard time keeping even storylines separate if they can't start a chapter and realize, oh, we're talking about this place, and then go back and look at the map and go, oh, this is across the continent from the thing I was just reading. They're not next to each other. And I think getting rid of a map, to a certain extent, is a little ableist. It's basically saying, hey, and I get the reasons you're wanting to get rid of a map and the things you're saying. That's not an ableist statement before I get yelled at for being mean. But saying that, like, you don't need a map, well, some people do, actually.
Your mom was late to come to the fantasy genre because she didn't like the idea that there were maps in these books and she'd have to keep track of all these different places. And that wasn't
trying
fun
to keep
for her.
track of it if it's not fun and you don't have a map to help you reference. I think that's harder. I think that's worse. I will say, however, the Dresden Files doesn't need a map.
You can have a map and not have to reference it. No one forces you to spend time memorizing the routes through the different parts of the continent.
But there are definitely portions of fantasy that don't need maps. I don't need to pull up a map of Chicago every time I hear about Harry going from one side of town to the other. It's fine.
He did build that little Chicago, which was very cool. A lot of work and didn't get used very much, but it was still cool.
Yeah, I won't talk about what happened to Little Chicago because this isn't necessarily a full spoil episode.
No, no. All right, those were the most unpopular fantasy opinions I found getting kicked around out there right now. I think in all of them we found okay little tidbits of validity behind the complaints, but it really so much of it comes down to just personal opinion and preference.
There's almost always a reason that someone has the opinion they do, but maybe it's not quite as black and white. And if you're really gonna choose those hills to die on, that's your choice. You can do that. I don't know if I'm gonna fully join you on any of them.
There were very few where we had a complete, though, of okay, anyone who thinks this is just an idiot. We didn't really go there. I mean, Tolkien is overpraised. Yeah, people need to check their thoughts on that. Okay, there's reasons that was about the big one. I mean, you had a pretty strong reaction to YA fantasy saturating the market.
Even on the Tolkien one, I was even willing to say, no, Tolkien may be overpraised. That's not saying Tolkien shouldn't be praised. So there's room to have a valid point within these opinions, so long as you don't take them to their extremes.
Okay. So as you've viewers listen to us here with this debate over these various opinions, what are your thoughts on them? Are any of them ones you think have more validity than we've given them credit for? Or are there strong pushbacks you'd have on any of these 13 that we listed? Put them down in the comments. Likewise, do you have your own horribly unpopular opinion about the fantasy genre that you'd like to spout off on? We give you a platform. Use the comment box and share what you think. I'll read and respond. And while you're doing that, look down in the show notes for other ways you can come and share your comments, an invitation to our Discord server, links to our social media preferences, even our email. And we mentioned appreciating patrons. A link to our Patreon page is included in the show notes. Okay, I think I'm done opinionating right now. How about you, Zach?
I'm fresh out of opinions.
Oh, that's a lie. But that's enough for now. Thanks for watching, everyone. We'll talk to you next time.